Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our session today. My name is Ron Bro, President and CEO of Top Step. So we're excited to bring you this topic today, which we feel is a timely topic given today's climate. So it's really about how do we manage resource capacity versus demand within your PS organization. So we'll hopefully share some tips and tricks that we use that you can then take to your business the same. So we'll go ahead and get started. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to cover pipeline tracking and demand. We're going to cover capacity planning and reporting, and then forecasting, both pipeline, and then we'll talk about reporting on demand planning as well. So when we think about demand, what are we defining here as our demand? Well, there are generally two buckets of demand that we report and we strive to get to. One is what's been sold versus what we call our backlog, right? These are the projects that customer have agreed to, work may have begun or work is scheduled to begin, and what is the remainder of that work look like in our system. So, and then also what do we expect it to close? What is our high degree of confidence pipeline that we need to layer into our demand so that we get a full picture of the future, both demand for resources versus the future capacity of our resource pool. So, and understanding both of these in your system is really critical to getting a full picture of what your overall demand looks like. And both rely on forecasting approaches to determine how your staffing needs. Capacity. What do we think of when we think of capacity? Well, there's generally three ways to think about capacity. How many FTEs do I have, right? So, if I have 20 FTEs, does that give me a good definition of what my capacity is? It could give you a good understanding, and we'll talk a lot about FTE reporting in some of the slides, but it's only one part of the overall picture, I think, when understanding what your capacity looks like. On layering on top of FTEs, you have to layer upon how many available hours do those FTEs have for delivering work for my customers. So that would factor in, vacations, holidays, downtime that you may have. So those are all, part of the calculation to define hours in addition to FTE. And then money. Money is a critical piece as well, because money factors into your available hours to be able to generate the expected amount of money. So being able to determine how much money a person can deliver based on their expected utilization, based on your hours, based on the number of headcount you have, all factors into determining what your capacity is. So we'll talk a little bit about how to measure the capacity in future slides. So let's talk about FTE. So OpenAir gives you several options for reporting on FTE. Within the resource module, there are FTE reporting values straight out of the box. So there's an assigned FTE, there's a booked FTE, but then there's other ways in the system to be able to get FTE data. Obviously, assigned and booked depends on whether you're using assignments or whether you're using bookings to determine your capacity and reporting and resourcing. You can see here, you can use the resource planner as another good option for seeing, FTE and overall utilization percentage. Obviously, we'll go through a few reports, but being able to report on the FTE is something OpenAir does give you the availability to do. So let's look and see how we can utilize that. Before we go into the additional utilization of FTE, we need to talk about generics, generic resources. So I'm sure all of you are aware of the benefit and the usage of generic resources. So, generics basically are free users that are not, you cannot log in, but you can basically define generics in any way you like to be able to use them in OpenAir. And in a lot of ways, they behave very similar to a full user. So they can have a role, a type of skill, a job code. You can have entity tags, custom fields. You can even have a skill profile tied to a generic user. So all of these things, as well as work schedules. So all of these come very handy in being able to use generics and layering in on top of your resource planning and your capacity generation reporting that we're going to talk about. Let's talk about job codes. Job codes are probably a really underutilized tool inside of OpenAir. And there's a lot of cool stuff that job codes do that are not obvious. So obviously, job codes, we generally see generics and job codes tightly tied together. So for example, if project management is a job code that a person a role on a project, then generally we'll have a project management that's a generic resource. Although that's not necessarily has to be 100% of the time the case. You can have, project manager as a role, but then maybe you have more granular generics because you want to be able to use generics for, getting down to a skill level or a particular other attribute. But, tying them together is generally what we recommend if we can to be able to get the type of reporting that we want to be able to get out of the system. And then when you do generics, there is a report in OpenAir that's probably not very well known called, a job code detail report. And one of the benefits of this is there's two reporting values that are come out of the box. So if you run a job code FTE or job code detail report, there is a quantity of staff current and a quantity of generics current. So the quantity of staff is really looking at your user count and by job code. So here you see project manager, we have 4 FTEs, and consultants, we have 13. So a total of 17 FTEs in this report. So that's really helpful because you can then incorporate that into some of the reporting and then be able to say, okay, well, this is our head count today. What does our future demand look like? And be able to see where you might have to look at hiring down the line, or some other method of bringing in additional resources into the organization. So a couple of things you want to make sure if you're running this report is you want to make sure you're excluding any inactive entities, because you don't want to pick up any inactive users as part of your quantity of staff on headcount today. So that's an important detail to make sure you set in the report. And then when you run this, using that job code as well, you can generate a report that looks at, your demand versus your quantity on staff. So in this scenario, we can see, here's our quantity of staff, and then we can look at, future dates to see what does our demand look like for the different job codes. So by doing a summary report by job code, we can include the quantity of staff as a detail field and then be able to show the capacity and demand in the future months and be able to see, where we're overstaffed, understaffed, and give you a good report there. And again, making sure you're excluding any inactive entities is important for this report to be accurate. So a couple of other tips and tricks, leveraging entity tags is really important. If you're doing reporting on any sort of users or generics, able to basically show people that are coming and going in the organization. A lot of times people will start work on a certain date and then end in the middle of a month, and you want to be able to include or exclude those. You can also show different other attributes, via entity tags on a user. So, using the entity tags and using job codes, you can get that basic role, basic skill for both generics and users. And then you can use that also as part of the reports to be able to drive the elements in the report to get a better level of accuracy. So let's talk about demand hours. It's the same approach as FTE, except we're going to basically be using more of the hours options out of the box. So depending on how you schedule resources, whether you pay, whether you basis it everything on assigned hours versus booked hours, you define your report to be able to show what are the hours that you have scheduled in the current month and the future months, by job code. You can do it by, by resource as well. The nice thing about job code is it'll sum everybody up to kind of show everybody, across the different roles in the organization and give you those balances. And then you can use that, include that in some of the quantity on staff options as well. In this scenario, there's a couple of other ones that are very useful as well. There's assigned hours with actuals and booked hours with actuals. So what these two calculations do is basically they look at assigned or booked hours from today forward and time entries today from yesterday back. So for generics, if you have a generic booked in a month and you run the report booked hours with actuals, obviously because generics don't enter time, it's only going to take booked hours for the remainder of the month for a generic. Whereas an employee, it will basically capture their actuals through yesterday and their future booked or assigned hours through going forward. So in this scenario, you get that good reporting for the current month to give you kind of a level set of where we are, and then be able to use that to be able to see how is our capacity versus what our demand was in the system for reporting. We talked about money being the other option with regards to how do we measure demand and as well as capacity. So measuring demand based on money, is really utilizing OpenAir's forecasting engine. So OpenAir has, as many of you know, they have two different ways to forecast both cost as well as billings and revenue. You can forecast based on charge projections. So in the charge projection engine, you basically define how do you want to project my future views of dollars. So it will basically give you options of booked or booked and approved hours. So those are some different methods that you can utilize. And then once you have the charge projection set up, and we'll talk a little bit more detail about some of the best tips and tricks there, you can be able to get the projected billing, projected revenue, projected costs, and then also projected revenue margin as well. These are all kind of standard out of the box reports. The other method that OpenAir gives you is something called straight line forecasting. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but basically the benefit of straight line forecasting is it doesn't require billing rules to exist or bookings or assignments for you to be able to actually forecast. It just basically takes the data inside the project, and it basically takes the budget and it multiplies it across a time period. So we'll show you in detail what that looks like in the next couple slides. So let's talk about capacity from money. There's a few settings that we recommend or that we use to help drive the reporting that I'm going to show you in the next slide. One of them is target utilization. This is basically being able to set, a target for the user based on what they're expected to bill. So for the example here, the target as of a certain date is 75%. So when I look at a 40-hour week and look at my target, then basically it kind of shows me what the expected hours in any period, whether it be weekly or monthly, that will give me the hours expected to work. The other thing we see used a lot, and we use it ourselves, is using a target bill rate. Now, there is a bill rate field on the user. However, that one has very limited reportability in the system that we found. So what we've done instead is, on the user, there's multiple cost levels. So everything in OpenAir comes with just the single cost, the primary cost. But you can also enable secondary and tertiary cost levels inside of OpenAir. And one of the benefits and one of the usages we see as common is using target bill rates. So in this scenario, we can set a target bill rate at a user level based on their role in the company. So we could say our project managers or or depending on how you cost out your projects based on roll or flat rate, you set that target rate. And then using cost, we can also adjust that rate year over year. As our bill rates go up year over year, we can adjust those historical rates down below. But the benefit of using a cost as a bill rate in this example is it gives you a lot of reportability that you can then report on. So once you have these two elements, you can create a custom calc that basically will generate a value that you can then report against. So what this custom calc does is it takes our base target hours. So once you turn on target hours and you set those up, one of the out-of-the-box values that comes from the resource module is base target hours. So this will show in a 40-hour week, if I'm 75%, target, it will show my base hours for that week as that calculation. It does that automatically. And then we can multiply that times our target bill rate. So by doing so now, we get what's the expected revenue to be generated by a particular resource for a particular time period, whether it be weekly, monthly, or what have you. And that's a really powerful value because now you get almost realization type reporting where you can compare what do we expect it to do versus what do we think we're going to do. So let me show you what you get out of that. So in this example, we're using that custom calc to drive total revenue capacity. So based on availability, based on our FTEs, based on all of our settings in OpenAir, the green is showing what our capacity is, and the blue is showing what our expected billing is over the next several months. And that's a combination of using generic resources as well as using named resources. So you can see as we get into the year how our projected billing starts to exceed our capacity. So what this tells me as an executive, I have a gap that I'm going to need to address at some point, and then I have to decide when do I need to address that gap. Do I address it, because I need time to ramp up my resources. So maybe I want to start hiring around April, so that I have folks ready to go for May, June, and forward. Otherwise, you're going to end up either having customer sat issues or burning out your existing staff. So, having this sort of view right out of the system, one-click report, is a really great picture of your professional service business and helps you make decisions on how to move forward. So going back to the charge projections, those are set up under the project settings. It will show you how often it runs in the status section. And generally, there's two options. Well, there's three options. Generally, you schedule these to run nightly. So each night, it's going to take a picture of your charge projection. It's going to create a charge projection table and overwrite the previous table. And it'll store all the values based on how your billing rules are set versus how your basis of hours, or if you're using fixed fee rules, it'll also bring those in as long as those are set based on the future date, as well as revenue recognition, methodology. Depending on if you're doing time-based as billed or percent complete, it'll calculate all that for you and store that on a nightly basis. There is also the availability, say you want to make some changes to a project, you want to adjust the schedule, and then you want to refresh right away and not have to wait for the charge projections to run. There's an option in a project to be able to just go in and say rerun charge projections. It's kind of an immediate little quick run of the charge projections. And then lastly, if you really do want to make a global refresh, you can go in and manually run charge projections at any point in time. And so that is another option for getting that updated data to report out correctly. So what are my options? So booked hours, assigned hours, approved hours, and worked hours, and some then combination thereof. So, obviously, if I'm using booked hours to project from, it's going to ignore actuals. It's only going to show my bookings in the future, and it's going to show me the dollars based on those bookings. But it's not going to give me, for the current month, if we've spent hours working and they don't align with what we booked or assigned, it's not going to give me that detail. It's only going to show what we planned. So a lot of customers will do either a combination of approved and booked or worked and booked, or depending if you're using bookings or assignments. And the benefit is, using approved and booked will give you, or worked and booked will give you that mid-month level of accuracy that you don't have otherwise. So it'll show, what do we actually do, and then what was remaining to give you a full month picture of your projections. So depending on how your system is set up, you'll want to look at how these projections are set up. The other thing to think about with projections is the start date. So when I think of projections, I think of the future. So we set it up to go this week plus 365 days. And that will give you the ability to always be looking forward and not backwards. And then when you're combining actuals plus booked or actuals plus assigned, you don't have a chance of actually double counting any data. So, and it also makes the charge projections run quicker by not going way back. We've seen where customers will set the date, way back in many years ago and many years in the future. And then so that would cause the charge projection table to run a little longer. So we try to look at just the future, and then we use our custom calcs to combine those views. We mentioned straight line projections. So straight line projections are really good, especially for pipeline projects, right? You've sold a $100,000 project, or you think you're going to sell a $100,000 project. It's still in the pipeline, but it's looking awful probable. And we think it's going to start in January and it's going to end in April. And so what OpenAir will do is, after you have this feature set up, is it will calculate the number of days, work days in each month, and divide the budget by the number of work days in between the start date and the end date stored on the project. So you have to have a start date on the project, you have to have an end date, and you have to have a budget for this to work. And you can see March is more days in March than there are in January and February, so you can see how it's projecting. The downside of straight line is it assumes that it's an even amount of work from start to end. And obviously projects don't work that way generally. Generally there's spikes and ups and downs throughout the project. But if you're looking to get just kind of a thumbnail of what's our pipeline look like and what's that project out, the straight lines could be a really good option, without having to go in and book everyone to the project and then set up actual billing or revenue recognition rules to the project. So, and the other thing I've seen with straight line that we've done for other customers is if you are connected to a CRM, for example, and let's say you're bringing over anything at 80% probability, we can bring those 80% in as part of the setup of the project, and then we can apply that 80% to the straight line projections for those projects. So you can actually use the probability of the opportunity to factor down the projections, so you get a little bit more of an accurate pipeline forecasting capabilities. There's a little bit of setup. It's not a switch for those of you that love the switch concept in OpenAir. It's kind of an Easter egg where you don't need a switch. You just have to do a few things. So there's custom fields that you would set up inside of the stage, and then you basically have to create an end date field, and the syntax has to be exact what's in this slide. And you can use the standard out of the box start. So it basically allows you to define what stages are straight line versus what stages are not straight line. And once you create these custom fields and enter the data, and then the charge projection does update these the way that I define, then you can start to report on these values. And then you can use custom calcs if you wanted to factor them down in some way. But it's not a switch, it's just a series of custom fields that enable this feature. So as you're thinking about demand versus capacities, another thing that we recommend is thinking about how do you tag your projects. And that could be really helpful in determining, as you look at your projects and you look at your demand, looking at it by the type of project could help you define, your capacity. So, what do a deployment project look like versus business efficiency look like, et cetera. And that would help kind of define the types of different skill sets needed for different types of projects, different types of roles. We don't do project management work for business efficiencies, for example, but we do for deployment. So being able to define those roles. So understanding the type of projects and defining those and tagging those, and then being able to report on those in these types of graphs and show, what percentage of your business is driven by which types of projects. Is another way to kind of help you get a vision of your PS and be able to, adjust and hire accordingly based on your expected demand of skill sets. So a few things in summary. There's a lot of ways to measure demand, as we saw in this thing. Also, there's a lot of ways for resource scheduling and forecasting approach to consider, especially when it comes to pipeline forecasting. So it's a critical component because a lot of customers, are able to do their forecasting in OpenAir, but they might have a spreadsheet where they're tracking their pipeline, and really being able to get everything in one system, get an output is really a best practice we try to get our customers to work with. And then being able to report on capacity versus demand is a very powerful metric and KPI that helps in a lot of make a lot of really tough decisions. Really bring those to the bubble. I mean, hiring and not hiring is one of the most important decisions that PS executives make and fight for and fret over. And having the raw data to show this is where we're going to be and this is where we are and this is the gap is a critical element to being able to support your decisions with facts in the system versus gut calls. And then being able to use OpenAir's functionality fully, right? Entity tags, job codes. We talked about target utilization. We talked about leveraging one of the cost values to track target bill rate. So these are all out-of-the-box features in your system that you can then use for advancing your getting a better reporting, better information out of OpenAir. And also some of the FTE values and job code quantities. Those are all values that are in your system today that you can take advantage of. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. Obviously, we appreciate your support for Top Step. If you don't already, make sure you join our newsletter. We send out a monthly newsletter, and follow us on Twitter. We send out tips and tricks multiple per day. We also have a LinkedIn group for OpenAir users. So we're here to really support the community and support you. So we appreciate your loyalty and your participation in our webinars.